another episode of the My Pilgrimage podcast coming out here. Today we're talking about the myth of redemptive violence. Think revenge porn movies. Came from a question that Garrett Ring left on the Facebook group talking about justice and bullying and talking about when you see something's wrong, don't you fight for it? And is that ego? These are all really, really good questions. So we decided to go ahead and just have a discussion. We invited Garrett to come along as well because, I don't know, having that other perspective is really, really helpful. Sometimes it's not just Seth and I just talking. So Seth and I and Garrett got together and had a wonderful discussion. And we're going to show it to you right now. And then I'll come back to the end and say goodbye.
Garrett.
Yes.
You are known to the people. You're a poster. You post in Facebook and you're in there in the group. And so Garrett Ring has joined my brother and I. We're going to have a discussion about your posts, sir, because for some reason, it was like my spirit was just like, we need to have a deeper discussion about that. You said in the Facebook post, and I quote, "Hey, Seth and David, I just listened to the latest podcast on social media. You both mentioned that when the need to defend something comes up, that is really your ego fixating on being right, and ultimately that is not something worth engaging. My question is, how does that line of logic and being go with defending a person or their rights who is in need or oppressed? Is it worth it to strive to be right when it comes to helping them, or is that more ego?" Can you expand on that or anything? I mean, is that pretty much sum it up real well what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I kind of came up with a just like a super simple example, I guess, yesterday as I was thinking more about it. And it was kind of just the classic example of if you were to watch a movie and you see like a bully, and he's like picking on someone or something like that, or picking on someone in the classroom or in the hall, and something inside you when you
Karate Kid's like situation.
Yeah, like Peter Parker type, that whole thing where it could be so many other things. But I just thought of that and thought that, okay, something inside me, if I see that, I'm like, that's not right. Mm-hmm. Like, I need to go defend that person. And it's kind of the thought process behind it of like, well, you think that bully is in the wrong for doing that, and you think that you are right for going to defend that person. So is that something other than ego, or is that ego spiking up, saying that you need to do something there? Like, I guess that was like my example I kind of thought of.
Is this a question about is the concept of justice an egoic one? Is that what you're trying to ask?
Yeah. That would be kind of what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. I think here's the thing you have to start with. This goes back to our programming. Were you a Christian? Are you a Christian? Are you an evangelical? What's your background?
I grew up kind of, my church was non-denominational, but eventually became evangelical free. Yeah.
Okay. Are you currently still a practicing evangelical Christian?
Yes, but there's a lot of deconstruction happening.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. And deconstruction is good. Even, when we're practicing, if we're practicing, in whatever denomination we're in, it's good to kind of be able to be, self-aware. So, in that line of thinking and in the way that the programming is strong. We always think in terms of wrong, right. And we always tend to identify the ego with wrong, right? So if the ego is doing something or the ego wants to do wrong, and it's not I found it's not at least for me, and Seth he probably has more articulate way of explaining this, but I found that the ego it's not that it wants to do bad things, and it wants to make me into a bad person, even though I would say that it thinks selfishly and it is unintelligent in a lot of ways. But we tend to immediately identify ego as the bad thing. So if I say, like what we were talking about in terms of defending, the need to defend yourself or defend what is right or whatever, that concepts of right and wrong as dualistic concepts, we automatically go, well, is that my ego that wants to, the Peter Parker thing that saved the kid from getting bullied or do justice, or is that my spirit? And I always tend to think of it in terms of a scale. The ego has a role to play there, but so does the spirit. Do you see what I'm saying? Like when we're talking about justice, we're talking about those things, and that I think that in those moments, it's probably the most difficult time to decipher which is what, if you're walking, if you're acting in spirit, if you're following the lead of spirit and doing physical violence, you know what I mean? And that kind of thing, or trying to defend someone physically, or trying to kind of jump in there. It's just that the programming is definitely like, we have to think about what's right. Seth, you jump in. I know you have a thought. He's smiling and he's got a thought.
Well, it's funny because I think my entire master's degree was focused around this concept. So this is one of the reasons when Garrett actually texted this question to me, and I said, dude, why don't you post that in the Facebook group? Because this is pretty great fodder. But the concept that's discussed in maybe more progressive theological circles is the idea of redemptive violence, right? Because here's the thing, like I'm a big fan of a movie genre that they call revenge porn.
Yeah.
Okay?
Oh,
yeah,
favorite revenge porn movie? And don't say John Wick.
It's not John Wick. Yeah, okay. That's a good. It's Man on Fire. Man on Fire is my favorite revenge.
Oh, Denzel, of course.
Yeah.
And mine is the Equalizer.
Yeah.
Or Equalizer.
And the Equalizer is a little. It kind of leans a little more into the Jason
Oh.
Statham kind of area of.
No, it's Denzel, man.
But it's Denzel. But the simplicity, the simplicity of the structure of it is more Statham-y. And Statham is his own category of revenge porn. He's made an entire career out of revenge porn, and foray into other spaces.
But he's not. But Denzel brings a complexity to the role that he plays.
Because he's just such a great actor. Yeah. But Man on Fire.
Thank you, Garrett.
Man on Fire adds.
Can I get a name in?
Yes, I love. I walked out of the theater watching The Equalizer, and I was like, oh my god! Like I was shocked. I was like, holy crap!
Oh, dude.
Jeez.
Well, and you have to see with your
good.
question. Your question centers around this idea of redemptive violence. Because we live in our culture, at least like countries like America, who espouse some sort of at least in our ideals, we try to espouse a more justice-based, almost Judeo-Christian type of ethic. Actually, what we have is a type of redemptive violence, right? The idea that good guys and bad guys. We keep making World War II movies because we can indulge in this idea that it was redemptive violence. It was the act of kicking out this evil guy, and we can create this very clear, delineated structure of good guys and bad guys, right? And actually, it's funny because we were watching The Last Jedi the other night, me and my kids, and my son had some. I knew he would have questions about this because he was just like, there was that one part where, they're on Canto Bight, and they're realizing that underneath it all, the concepts of good guys and bad guys is just a matter of perspective. It's just a matter of So the idea that you're getting at, the idea of helping others, I think that where you find. David's spot on when he says it's a question of ego and spirit. And again, not judging the ego as evil. The ego functions from a certain level of consciousness, and it has its own purpose. The ego's purpose is just survival, period. Right. And it will help us survive by creating a narrative in our mind that has a certain structure. Good guys and bad guys is an egoic narrative. So when the way you see politics functioning right now, right, the way you see like in the Black Lives Matter movement, it's a great concept, this idea of social justice for the poor, justice for these concepts are redemptive concepts. But the problem is that because most people function egoically for the purpose of survival, the ego creates a collective narrative of redemptive violence, right? I mean, this is the thing I think one of the most probably apropos type of studies is if you look at the space between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King is a really interesting one, because you have someone who on one side is espousing to a redemptive violent narrative, saying we are justified to take our freedom by any means necessary, right? And you can't say he's wrong. No. And on the other side, you have someone who has come to a recognition that the energetic quality of that the ego cannot achieve actual freedom and redemption. It can't. Right. So the ego can only create a narrative of redemptive violence. It can't actually create redemption itself. So when we see, that's why movies like that have to have an ending
and then sequel.
Right.
This is like the Taken movies. Like I remember the Taken, you get to the end and you win, and you go, no. What's the storyline for the next film? Yeah, is
Taken again.
That dude's brothers now have to and it's gonna.
Well, and there's a beauty hidden into Hollywood. I think that there's a certain level of intellectual honesty sometimes that exists in Hollywood, or at least in the writers that create these stories, because they realize, like, if you notice, the heroes that kind of, you know, actually do this violence, they do this redemptive violence, are almost always completely miserable. They're almost, you know, when you got what was the Tom Cruise character, Jack Reacher, right?
Oh,
Jack Reacher, just miserable and alone. You know, the Equalizer, miserable and alone. You have, like, I mean, my favorite, you know, revenge porn movie is Man on Fire. Alcoholic, miserable and alone, right?
John
you
Wick,
have
miserable and alone.
John Wick, miserable and alone. They're always,
he killed his dog and now he's really alone.
right? So they have no choice but to live. You know, I mean, you know, John Wick got out because he found love, right? But he still, that love failed him because he was still having to find his love from an external source. So now he has to go back into this kind of violence.
Right.
But you have, this is one of the reasons why I like Man on Fire so much, is that Man on Fire, he ends the cycle of redemptive violence by giving himself as a sacrifice. This is this is the Christian narrative. When we see Gandhi, when we see MLK, when we see even Nelson Mandela sacrificed not only his life, but his livelihood, his family. He sacrificed everything, gave of himself, of his own blood, sweat, and tears, as opposed to, you know, moving into more a violent cycle. And that's the only way. That's the only way actual redemptive, and it's an energetic, and you can get into the physics of that, of how that works. But that is the difference. The difference is, this is what Jesus was saying when we talk about dying to self. He who seeks to save his life will lose it. Well, the cycle of redemptive violence is one of saving his life. And I'll tell you guys this. I live in a neighborhood where cops and meth heads and there's just, it's
Bike
crazy.
Thieves.
Yeah, no, this is the neighborhood I live in. Like, I come out, I had my mountain bike just right out in front of my apartment the other day. I turned upside down. I was working on the chain. I was putting some lube on the chain, and then I go in and I lost track of something, got distracted. I left it out there for about an hour. I come out, it's gone. You know, it's a nice mountain bike. And I was kind of sad because I just recently got it and discovered this kind of beautiful, fun world of riding bikes and trying to get some fitness. And I'm like, man, you know, and I start driving my car around my neighborhood because I knew it's not some crafty thief that's been hiding in the bushes waiting to steal my bike. You know what I mean? Because that's not my neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I'm driving down my Rainier and I see two meth head teenagers walking on the side of the road with my bike, and I pull over and go, hey, I go, just like this. Hey, she goes, kind of looks at me. I go, that's my bike. Can I have it back? And she's like, sure. I'm like, can you just like lay it down right there? And they're like, and she just laid it down, and I just got it through. I'm not angry, not anything like that, because that's not going to help anything.
Yeah.
But I realized that she was expecting, on an energetic level, I felt her energy spike, and she was expecting the otherness, the push-pull, the violence, the contention, the good guy, bad guy experience of someone going, I'm reporting you to the cops or whatever. And she didn't expect this just kind of loving, and she just kept walking. Right. And I could tell that they were kind of walking away going, that was weird.
Right.
You know what I mean? A few days ago, I'm walking up a street, and there's this kind of street where all the homeless people hang out. And I see two cops. I'm looking down the street, and one of the cops has his hand on his gun. This African-American guy's walking away, and he's yelling at the cops, and the cops are yelling at him. And I'm looking at him going, in light of everything we're experiencing, I had this narrative in my brain, like, am I willing to just stand between them? You know what I mean? And I stood there kind of frozen, because I was like, am I willing, for the sake of love, to stand between them? Now, redemptive violence would be a violent act, right? I'm going to come in, and I can do justice, and maybe someone will catch it on a phone and put it on the internet, and it'll go viral, and I'll be a hero, and maybe I die or whatever. I don't know. But the thing is, I was wondering, what would it be like to walk up and just stand between them? And I sat there, and immediately my ego just spiked. I mean, this huge survival narrative came up. You've got kids, you can't do this. And I'm sitting there going, oh, that's what it is, man. It's this clinging to our lives. So many of us at such base unconscious levels are scared to die. And Jesus was speaking to a complete and total loss of that fear. Right. And that's the thing. That's the entire narrative of the cross, is one that speaks to a new kind of understanding, a more evolved understanding of what justice actually is. So justice wasn't Jesus dying on the cross. Jesus was, I mean, it was in a sense, but he's not, when we talk about him taking on the sins of the world, that we have to understand that not from some weird metaphysical theological standpoint, but from a philosophical standpoint, like what was it to say, that, I mean, literally there's a reason that 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this, that he took that on himself, as opposed to what everybody was calling him to do: start a rebellion, start a revolution. And you see it because the first Christians weren't going to war against Rome. The followers of the way that you see in the book of Acts, they weren't going to they were just free. We don't have to feel oppressed every day. We can give to the poor. We can love on each other. And I don't think the Romans were mad about that. The Romans weren't like oppressing the first Christians. They weren't doing that. It didn't get that way until the Jewish people started oppressing them. Yeah, and that persecution was a religious persecution. It wasn't until they became where it became this kind of the message of the disintegration of religion, started to become a problem when Paul was going out and preaching those messages. But at first, it was just a bunch of people going, we don't have to live with the burden every single day of violence and anger. I mean, the Jewish people were. I mean, that insurrection thing was happening underneath the surface at all times. All
the time, yeah. They were looking for their Messiah who was going to defeat the Romans.
Exactly. Yeah. And these were people that were literally pulling out of that narrative, right, and saying, we can live free because we are free inside.
Right. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go back to that Peter Parker.
Yeah. And I want to hear Garrett's
sorry.
Real quick, though.
Yeah, go.
Because I have two things, because this is literally my whole thought process yesterday as I was thinking about it. I wrote this down. When Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross daily and follow me. I used to read that as, oh, you must take on the burden each day of like all the sins and all that kind of stuff, and kind of like live this kind of life in a way. But now, as I read it, I kind of wrote this. I said, when Jesus says you must deny yourself and take up your cross daily to follow me, I read that now as Jesus saying, you have to face the reality that walking the life I walk means each day you're okay with dying rather than fighting, and that you will never fight or go to war with anyone ever again. Your posture is surrender and death.
Yeah.
And so like, I think that's, so if you take that and you put that into the narrative that Seth was talking about with the police officer and the guy, and that whole tension is ego spiking. If you're talking about ego's only goal is to survive, if you were to step into that situation between them, mm-hmm, are you saying that that's no longer ego? That's you kind of living like in the spirit in a way? Or if you still step in there and there's an act of violence that you take, like the redemptive violence, is that still ego acting up?
Right. So if I step in, let's say that I'm in a scenario, I'm at Peter Parker, okay, and Flash, the classic comic book bully, is over there beating up on some kid, yeah, and I say, hey Flash, you got to stop. Yeah. Now, my spirit understands things that are outside of the physical kind of material experience we're having here. If I'm in spirit, I actually can sense inside of Flash a lot of fear, and a lot of anger and some other things.
Yeah.
My spirit also leads me to compassion and understanding and wisdom and other things that don't necessarily mean that I want to hurt him either. Right.
Right.
So I might step in and I'd say, Flash, put him down, and Flash doesn't do that, whatever. And I step in and I physically step into that space. Now, if I attack Flash, okay, if I do that, because I think that's the best way to do justice in this situation, I am starting a cycle of violence, right? Because I'm stepping into his mm-hmm. energy field, his frequency, his entire thing. Yeah. All that anger is there, and now I'm stepping into that, and like what we talked about in terms of Seth was talking about quantum entanglement, how my vibration is now matching up with his.
Yeah.
His dance, yeah. Right? If I stepped in between him and this kid, and I just stood there, and I said, I'm not going to let you hurt him. You can hurt me instead, but you can't hurt him.
Yeah.
And he smacks me in spirit. And this is the only way I can do this. I can turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
I can only do that.
That vibration is pulling him to you.
Right.
And so it's a matter. It's a turf thing. Whose turf are we on here?
There's a great
whose pool are we going to swim in?
Exactly. You know what I mean? There's a fantastic example. There was a viral video that actually went around the internet a few days ago And it was a protest, and I can't remember. It was a Native American tribe, and I can't remember the name of the tribe or exactly where. But it was a Native American tribe that was doing a protest, and they were protesting about abuses to their land and that kind of thing. And they were doing chanting, and there was and I want to say it was in South Dakota, but there was a gal, drunk white lady, really angry, super Trump fan, and she was screaming and swearing, and she went right at them, and she started and literally punched one of them in the face. The gal stood there, and she stood there, and she said, "You can't do that." After she got smacked hard, like closed-fisted punch across the face, she just stood, and she kept saying that, and none of them attacked this lady or tried to defend themselves anyway. They just stood there. And the gal just kept going, "You mother effing blah, blah, blah." She was just going at them, and Trump 2020, and you're going to live, and you guys are all, literally just going. You can find it. It's amazing. And they just sat there. And then eventually it was crazy to watch her like a wild animal trapped in a cage trying to figure out what to do because no one was joining her in her.
They weren't feeding.
And the thing is, the nature of it is she's being forced to feel her own energy.
Right.
She has to feel the entity. She has to feel all that trauma that's coming up inside her body. When the ego is used to, if the ego can project it and find a connection in that projection,
right,
that she doesn't have to feel that energy.
Right. If somebody in that group, just one of those people in that group had lashed out, we're on. We got it. Okay, good.
Yeah.
We're in.
Yeah, we're in the cycle.
And the cycle goes. But instead, they all ended up standing next to each other, like singing songs. And this gal just stood there. She's just like, and they're actually like doing like a peace chant, and it was amazing, and it reminded me of Martin Luther King Jr. in Atlanta, in his home in Atlanta, as he stood, and these white supremacists, the KKK, lit his house on fire with his family in it, and he got his family out, and everything was fine. But this whole horde of African American neighbors and everybody coming to him, they're all ready, and they're ready to fight, and they were ready to kill. He's standing in front of his burning house, saying, "That's not the way. It won't do anything.
Right.
We're not going to do that. You guys, it'll set us back. This is going to hurt us. If we fight, if we join them in that, it will actually hurt us."
Yeah.
And if you go to Atlanta and you go to the tomb of Martin Luther King and you go to the museum that's across the Peace Center and across the way and stuff like that, and there's this beautiful statue out in front of Kunta Kinte, holding from the famous novel, holding his child up to the sun. And then you walk around the corner up to the right, there's a pathway, a little walkway, and there's a statue of Gandhi with his walking stick walking. And he's like in mid motion walking. And there's these paved stones, and everybody on those stones were people that were committed to that peaceful resistance, that had committed to that way of thinking. And that is why and it's exactly what Seth was talking about. Every meaningful evolution in human history was because somebody got that. Like it clicked, and we can look at war and we can see it, utter destruction. You can go, well, what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, yes, it brought everything down, but you don't think that that's going to come back around? You don't think that kind of violence has started its own little mini cyclones all over the world?
Yeah,
of course. It started the nuclear arms race. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
it started the arms race and it left millions of people traumatized who then inflict that trauma on others. This is when in the Bible says that the sins of the fathers are passed down to the third and fourth generation, that it's speaking about that cycle of violence, which is why it's so beautiful when you see someone step up and say that cycle of my family's trauma ends here.
Right.
Because I'm healing myself and it ends here. And then, when the ego doesn't need to defend anymore.
Right.
Because I do therapeutic work. You see it in every person I come in contact with, every client that I work with that's in an intimate relationship. That's the thing. There's a cycle of this kind of, not necessarily always violence, but emotional violence that's just going back and forth. And one person in the couple is finally like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And they're seeking a higher way so that there can actually be transformation. That was me and my wife, and that's everything, man. But it is interesting. We have to study it I mean, I'm watching my kids because we watch all the Marvel. You want to talk about cycle of violence? Like the Marvel movies are just these ridiculous, stupid
Marvel
cycles of violence.
Cinematic Universe.
Yeah. I mean, it's just keep going. And eventually I wonder if we'll all go, it's getting a little pathetic now. Like eventually, I mean, we beat Thanos. Seriously, we got to keep going. Like that was supposed to be the end of the violence, but it doesn't. It never, ever ends.
Right.
Because, millions and millions of people now are traumatized, right?
Right.
We can talk about World War II. My grandfather won all kinds of medals and stuff like that.
Won the Silver Star.
Yeah,
in
World War II,
Wow.
and they stopped Hitler and they stopped the Empire of Japan. And they stopped all this kind of thing. Well, he brings his trauma home and traumatizes his entire family, which then leads to trauma. And we're all results of that trauma.
Yeah,
that's been passed down to generation after generation.
Right.
And David and I were, when David was first a dad and when I was first a father, we, we're still trying to heal and stuff. We pass some of that trauma on to our kids. And,
right.
And
let me jump in there though. It's not to say that we should. That's not to say that we shouldn't have fought against Hitler. Obviously, right. That's the thing, and that's where the mind tends to go. The human mind tends to go is
that's the hard part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and that we immediately go, well, was that wrong then? Should we not? No, those are not functional and helpful terms right now.
Well, this is one of the hardest points of what's happening politically. The way social media and the way story narratives, how those narratives are told on social media are shaping the way we do politics now. Is that we can't, it's almost impossible, it seems, to find a leader that can hold that kind of complexity.
Right.
Like, give me one person.
It doesn't campaign well.
And it campaigns horribly, especially on social media. No. And we can't seem to have anybody who understands the nuance and complexity of moving from the attempt to move from ego into a more spirit driven kind of way of being. I mean, you have that, you're absolutely right. We had to go to war. We had to stop Hitler, but that was pure ego.
Right.
It had to be done, and it was pure ego. That's why it's not helpful to judge the ego as our enemy. It's not your friend. I tell people this all the time because there's some sort of, someone's encountered some psychodynamic therapy or some teacher's way of thinking, and they think their egos are, well, my ego is to be loved and nurtured, and I don't have to see it as my enemy. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's not your buddy. Like, and it's not a good thing that we went to war. It's not a good thing at all. Right. Was it necessary? Yes, it was a necessary evil, but let's call it what it is. It was still an evil.
Right.
World War II is not a good thing because we can paint these narratives and make a bunch of movies that have some sort of redemptive thing. But, understand that, like, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, I mean, even today, like that's the struggle is people are they'll try to make movies about what's been happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they just have to find these little pockets where something redemptive happened here, where we can, say good guys and bad guys, because it doesn't sell well at the box office to say that doesn't exist.
Yeah, the third Matrix really, really left a lot of people disappointed.
Well, especially the Christians, right? It pissed them off because they had their good guys and their bad guys, and
especially the Christians. And the irony, of course, is that at the end, it's the Jesus story, and he in Neo, gives himself as the sacrifice to create the peace between the machines and between the humans. And that was so, I remember everybody, and I had the same experience. I remember thinking, oh, that's so unsatisfying, you know what I mean? It just, and that's what thinking of, like, the Harry Potter is another Jesus narrative, except for at the end of Harry Potter, he comes back alive and then he kicks ass, you know what I mean? And you're like, yes, that's what we need. Go ahead. Yeah.
That's why the hard part is, like, I grew up with very few stories that I can think of that I'm like, okay, if I'm in a situation, what else do I do other than fight back?
Right.
Like, what else do I, and so when I hear these stories of, like, the Native American tribe, or, like, all these stories where it's like this sacrificial love in a way that's taking place, there's something that kind of beautiful that resonates inside of me, but there's also another side that is sad, because I know that if I want to follow this line, I can't, I have to choose not to engage in this violence or learn how to become a black belt so I can go, like, beat up someone who's trying to rob me or all this kind of stuff, because it's like, there's something about me, like, that is so cool. I want to do that. I want to protect myself. I want to prepare. But then there's something sad. I'm like, that's not, there's something deeper that's like, I can't, like, you can't do that. Like, it's
well that well
more out
but
a lot.
it's not a choice between it's not a choice as in as much the choice is between, do we live through our spirit or through our ego? Because the more you learn how to walk in spirit, the more you learn how to let your spirit make all your decisions, and the more you practice daily, whatever your spiritual practice is, whether that's meditation or yoga or the thing that helps your center kind of come to to the forefront, your higher self kind of take the driver's wheel. When you do that, the repercussions of that, the byproduct of that becomes those instincts. When you're the part of you that and I love how you said it's sad, and it is. Your ego is literally grieving the loss of the narrative.
Yeah.
And
Well, and its own loss of its
Yeah.
own control. It fears its own death.
Yeah.
It really does. The ego fears its own death, and it's our buddy. It's been holding our hand, and there's this.
Right.
It's very much the Gollum thing, where would you be without me?
Yeah.
We survive because of me. But as we loot, that is the path to enlightenment. The loss of the ego's control over our lives is the path to, and that is the path that Jesus walked. That's the path that he showed us. That is the Christ narrative. That is everything about that.
Right.
But it just doesn't. It doesn't play well and doesn't sell well in a third dimensional world.
No.
At that level of consciousness, you are literally, you are stepping closer to the loss of even the fear of death. And
the irony, Garrett, is that you said I didn't grow up with these stories. That's the weird thing, is that we all did. Of course, the most dominant story in all of our
with the Jesus story
was the Jesus story.
Yeah,
and
but
Peter and Paul.
I was never taught it like that.
Right.
It was always he died for the sins of the world, and it's like he was doing his part to save us in that way, but it was never this. I never saw it through a sacrificial lens, even though that was exactly what it was.
Right.
Like
Well, because it was cast into a world of good and evil. It was cast into the other. Yeah. Because you can't have that story without the devil and the hell and that kind of thing. You just can't have that. As opposed to, this is why the radical Christianity, that people like Pete Rollins teaches, right, is a much, even though it's an atheistic, it's like God doesn't exist in that realm. It's so much more redemptive, and it's so much more beautiful, and it's so much more Christian than an evangelical way of thinking about it. Because it's like when he says it is finished, what if it's just all finished? Like, it's all over. The gods do not require any sacrifice any longer, and therefore, like Bonhoeffer was saying, right, that to live in a Christian impulse is to live as if God doesn't exist.
That was Eckhart, right?
No, that was Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he, in his letters to when he was in the Nazi prison. He's reflecting on it, and he's coming close to death, and he's in prison with people of all these different faiths that are all being persecuted, and he's like realizing, I think he was really asking himself, what's the difference between the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith and the Christian faith? And he's saying, there's this story of the end of the gods, right? That's what it is. It is finished. When he says God does not require sacrifice, there is no redemption needed. There is no separation between us and God. It's just a matter of our eyes being cleared. And that's why he talks about a Christian impulse is to live in the world as if God doesn't exist. He says, at one with the suffering in the world. The idea is we don't have to look up anymore.
Right.
And we can that will clear our vision to see what's in front of us, the suffering that's all around us all the time, that we can actually do something about it. And that's why the social justice thing is I think a more evolved way of doing Christianity. I still think that if the ego is not dealt with, it tends to take on, a good and evil thing. That's what you see in a lot of the liberal movement is this. There's still Trump's the evil. He's the devil. We just choose a new enemy, and we can still feel justified because he's doing evil things. It's very much the Hitler thing. That's why Hitler is the litmus test for evil. Anytime someone calls somebody else Hitler, that's real evil. As if we're justified in judging him like we would judge everyone, anybody else. I had a guy asking me that this morning. It's like, well, what was the point of Jesus's death then? Because he couldn't understand it outside of that duality, that black and white, good guy, bad guy thing.
Right. That narrative that frankly is not even that old, that whole redemptive kind of, that idea of substitutionary atonement being the only point of Jesus. That was the first big kind of just deconstructive moment for me when I kind of woke up and I started my healing work, is that Jesus had all these teachings, and that I had spent all my time focused on this narrative that his only point of existence was to die because there was this God that required blood to be okay with us. And and instead of listening to everything he taught and going, wait, he was like, there was so much, oh my gosh, there's so many amazing teachings. And when you can look at it from this perspective, you go, that dude like was incredible. And it's like, if you were to think about MLK, Martin Luther King, and go, the only point was, when he got shot that day, that was the main thing he contributed.
Right.
Was he got shot. It's his death. And his death was absolutely a redemptive moment in that it essentially led to the Civil Rights Bill and being passed, and all the civil rights legislation in the early 70s was because of Martin Luther King's dying, his sacrifice. It wasn't because of Malcolm X,
right,
who was also killed, and a lot of the people that were hurt. It was the Edmund Pettus Bridge and all these innocent people being pummeled and giving their bodies over to the these police and these that were just beating the tar out of them. It was those sacrifices that were creating that change. But man, Martin Luther King had some amazing sermons. One of my favorite moments was being just down the street from where his tomb is Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father was a pastor, where he grew up, and it's just down the street from his house, right? It's just really close. Everything's within a nice little kind of neighborhood. And then he was the pastor of that church for a while too. And you can go in there and his sermons are just playing on a loop. And you can sit in the pews and just listen to his sermons. And it's not changed at all. The church is just the same. And it's amazing. Like, you can just sit in. We were in there, Maria and I, my wife and I, sat in the front row and just sat there. There was no one else there, and listened to this entire sermon that he gave. And it was all the same stuff. I mean, this whole quote that he has right now that's circulating all over social media, that the arc of justice, right? The arc, it's long, right? But the arc of time is long, but it bends towards justice. That it is, we will always end up working. It's a 2-step forward, 1 step back process. And that we have to commit ourselves to that non-resistance, to that peaceful way of living, and to that redemptive story within ourselves. Yeah. So Garrett, for you, that impulse is going to be, how do I face death? If you're in a situation, and I mean, quite materially, you're in a situation where someone's being hurt. How do you step into that moment with just as much compassion for the perpetrator as for the victim? That's some enlightened stuff, man. And that's for enlightened beings. That's for people that are like literally like digging into the deep dirt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That is not, and that's why Jesus is saying it's so hard to do.
Yeah. I've already my thought process has already started to go that way, and it's just crazy to think. I'm like, wait, how come when I think how do I think about this person that's supposed to be this evil person? I'm like, and I start thinking past, I'm like, well, what happened to him for him to get to this spot right here? And how, because there's part of me in this narrative of like, well, if I don't fight back and end it, then they're just going to keep coming back. They're going to keep coming back. They're going to keep coming back. Yeah. But as you can see, like, for instance, like the movie Unbroken, as you can see, when he's like in the Nazi training camp and the guy's like forcing him to hold the wood above his head for like the whole day or whatever. Right. And he just keeps like whipping him and stuff. And eventually he doesn't fight back. And eventually the guy just like breaks. Right. Because he's like, how come, like, he's not giving in. And so there's like this, I think for me, I'm starting to see this physical, intangible evidence of this kind of like energy in this collective field that you talk about, because it's like, you're not giving in. And without giving in, like, that's why when I walked out of the movie Hacksaw Ridge, it wasn't like this redemptive, like, oh, this is amazing. Right. Like, I want to go like fight. I walked out, I'm like, gosh, I don't want to play a war game ever again. Right. Or like, I don't want to watch a war movie ever again. Cause it's like, this is sad. This sucks. Like, and so I'm beginning to see myself that, well, they may keep coming back, but eventually it's going to break, and it's stopping with you right there, because you're not giving into that field. You're not giving into that. And so it's
either that, or you get killed.
Awake to that. Or I get killed. Yeah.
Or you get killed. Well, and that's the point, right?
Person, you know?
That's the
And
point.
hey,
Yeah.
and Garrett, it's an amazing. I gotta say, it's an amazing thing to watch you wrestle with this because, you know, being a white kid and you're not a kid anymore. You're like a white dude on the west
23, okay?
on the west coast of the United States, you know, in such a privileged position to be able to wrestle with such complexity is an amazing thing. And the hard thing is that in this day and age, when you have so many people that have been oppressed so much, you know, with you know, I was thinking about Breonna Taylor, right? And everybody's saying no justice for Breonna Taylor, right? Because someone has to, they keep saying it, someone has to be held accountable
Right.
for her. Well, the thing is, you know, the ego, that collective ego, is out there looking for a person to put this on,
Right.
as opposed to where all of us fully wake up to the system that created that in the first place and saying that's what needs to be held accountable, and that's the movement. And of course, there's plenty of people waking up to that. You know, I just wish that this is what I wish sometimes the media would stop with this whole narrative, this constant narrative that we have to find the one person that's responsible. I mean, they're literally in the investigation, they're trying to figure out who fired the bullet that actually killed her. And I'm going,
it'll never
that's
end.
the Christ narrative is that's the point. It wasn't one bullet, right? That's it's millions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's millions of bullets that penetrated her body. And that's the story of the beaten and broken. You see all these Christ figures coming up through this movement. You see George Floyd, and you see all these guys. It's a Christ figure. That's why I love the mural. Like there's murals painted all over downtown Seattle, because Seattle's still pretty boarded up. But you have this, there's this one huge mural at a very prominent place by Pike Place Market. And it looks, it's a Christ mural. And people come and they lay flowers at it, and I'm looking at it, and it's not George Floyd worship. It's not yet. Now, 1,000 years from now, maybe there is a religion founded on George Floyd, and they're all praying that he'll heal their, you know, goiters or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, and George Floyd doesn't heal them, and they keep, you know, thinking that, well, but George is a benevolent God, you know. But the thing is, right now, it's an actual Christ figure. It's one of those things where we're starting to realize that this Christ figure he's waking us up. He's showing us our true selves. He's showing us where it not only where the darkness lies inside of us, but where the light is as well. And
there's another kind of, I guess you'd say, popular kind of narrative of that. There's a writer named David Mitchell. He's an Irishman. He wrote a book called Cloud Atlas.
Oh, I've seen the movie. I haven't read the book yet. I have the book, but I haven't read it yet.
The book is way better.
I actually think I saw that movie, Cloud Atlas.
The book's way better than the film. The film's good, but if we read the book, and I had read the book before I saw the film, and you read it and you go, and then when I heard they were making a movie, I was like, what? There's no way, because it's one of those books that you read and you go, there's no way a person could actually make that into a movie. And the way that, of course, the way you have to format a film in terms of the way they have to move each story forward at the same time. Whereas in the book, it starts out in the oldest story and you read half that story. And then it slowly progresses in time, reading half the story to get to the one furthest in the future. And you read the entire story, and then it starts to go backwards and it ends back where it was. And it's this incredible story. But one of the fascinating things is, of course, that it has the Jesus narrative built in, right? With this Korean woman who's a clone, right? And she ends up dying. But then when you get to the furthest future, where is post-apocalyptic world, and you're in Hawaii on the Big Island, like Kona, and they're with his tribe and stuff. And in the film, it was played, Tom Hanks plays this tribesman and stuff. There's a religion that was founded on the sacrifice of this woman, on who she was, and they pray to her, and they have a priestess and everything, and it's fascinating because that's exactly, it was like what you just said about George Floyd, is that obviously it's all, we have digital records and stuff like that, but if I all went to, and how Cloud Atlas illustrates that is essentially a post-apocalyptic event happens and all technology is kind of destroyed besides this one group of people that kind of are these super advanced people that stayed away from that. But everybody else is living back in the dark ages, you know, in tribal kind of modalities. And now you have this religion based on the writings of this gal who essentially left these recordings at the end of her life that she was having this awakening to that peaceful resistance. And it's fascinating because you have to, you got to read the book. It's a fascinating thing. The film is a little bit odd in how they kind of illustrate it. But again, it's going back to this idea of the only way actually forward is through that peaceful non-resistance, and through actual redemptive sacrifice, not redemptive violence.
Right.
So,
That's
fellas, any
love.
closing thoughts here? Garrett, why don't you go first, man?
Oh man.
The
This
pressure's
was, I mean, I think I said all I needed to, that kind of came to mind when we were talking, but this is, it's crazy to see myself 4 years ago to now, and kind of how everything's kind of just changed, and how I can, like, this stuff when I'm speaking it, like something's just coming up this kind of from within, and it's really cool. And I don't know, just the opportunity just to get to talk about this has been really cool, and to hear you guys talk about it is awesome.
Do you feel right now, that flow you're feeling, that you're describing a flow? It's a movement, an internal movement. And that's okay.
Yeah,
that's spirit.
Like when you, I mean,
that's what that is, to be in spirit.
Like
that's what that is.
Okay. Yeah. Cause it's just so different. It's, I don't know, when I start like speaking about this kind of stuff, it's like, oh, like it's different than like when I'm sitting and I'm processing, or I'm like letting like things out. It's like this, it's like, wow, it's this amount of energy, but then also this peace at the same time, just to be able to be, I don't know.
Right. And it's the sense,
that's the essence of what it is to be in spirit. If you're in your spirit, is the operating system that you're functioning in right now. That's the thing. It has all kinds of physical benefits. Like there's a lot of energy. People that are tired all the time is because they're mostly in their egos. Like when you function in your spirit, there's inspiration, there's creativity, there's synchronicity, there's intuition, there's massive amounts of energy because your heart chakra opens up. There's so much available to us through that highly hyper intelligent operating system that's connected, grounded into the entire universe. And you're functioning that, but also you're experiencing time distortion, because in that time, all of a sudden time starts to disappear a little bit. Time and space function a little differently, and you can feel your future. That's when people can go, I feel called, when they're in spirit, because your future is actually invading your space a little bit. And so that's why you have to follow it. You gotta follow this experience.
But also, like, you get this feeling of courage, and you feeling of like, well, I don't have to worry about it. And also you end up saying things and articulating things that you hadn't necessarily articulated in your head before you said it. And you go, where did that come from? And man, it felt good to say that. And you feel the path, like I was saying, you feel the path down the road,
Yeah. And like, for me, I'm surrounded by people that are just for, like, they're not for like violence, but at the same time they are like the underlying kind of just, I mean, I live right next to a military base. Like I live like in all this kind of stuff. And so but I guess when I talk about this, and when you're living kind of in this spirit mode, rather than me being scared of having a different thought, I'm okay. Cause I can kind of just sit and be okay with the fact that, no, I don't stand for that anymore. I don't believe for that. I think there's another way. And it's interesting to be able to be okay being in that problem with, like, no matter what happens, I'm here. Like, I'm spirit. If I die, it's like, I don't know. It's interesting. It's quite an experience.
Right on.
Just one little piece of advice: resist the urge to have to define it all. Just allow it, right? And our egos are very quickly want to hijack that process, and they wants to nail it down and kind of figure it out, and then also wants to tell everybody else how to do it that way. Just allow it. Just allow it to flow, allow it to be, and just enjoy it, because it's a lovely way to live.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I've stepped into that many times, and I've had to, this isn't working for me, like trying to be right, like we were just talking about, or trying to have it all together. It's like, just be, and it really allows you to start relying on God more, or like trusting God more with where your life. You just keep taking a step and trust that something's happening.
Yeah, man. Seth, closing thoughts on your side.
That for me, I think it's incredibly important that people like us that live in such an extremely privileged position, white guys in the most powerful empire that's ever existed on the planet, and we sit in the most powerful position. I think it's incredibly important that we wrestle deeply with the complexity of it, and of how this attends to the ones that are most marginalized, the ones that are most oppressed, to our Native American friends, to our LGBTQ friends, to our African American friends, to people of color. I think it's important that we have the courage to start to lay down some of that privilege one piece at a time. I think, my wife and I, and we've lived a life of radical faith for a long time, and it led us into some pretty profound spaces, and it led us into homelessness at one point. And we ended up in this apartment, which is a terrible apartment in a terrible building in what some would probably call a terrible place. And it's not. And we discovered almost 2 years here in what you could call the ghetto, that there is I'm so glad we ended up here. I'm so glad we were homeless. We got in here because you didn't need first and last month's rent, and because they couldn't get people to move into the building. And I'm so grateful that we ended up here, because what I have discovered in living in this space, that the complexity of it is so much more than I understood before. It's like, I'm not allowed in this place. I'm not allowed to hold those categories and those simple definitions of things, because the complexity is too much. That's why I can go to someone who just stole my mountain bike and go, "Hey, can I have that back, please?" And like speak that, you know what I mean? Because I've learned in 2 years here that there's so much complexity to how trauma functions, and how people function, and how these collective function, how systematic oppression functions.
Sure.
I'm incredibly grateful for it. And I would challenge every person that's listening to this, that if you want to engage these things beyond your intellect, to intentionally place yourself, not for 2 weeks on a mission trip where you can hold your, I mean, that's the entire structure of church mission trips, is to allow you to still hold the redemptive white savior kind of, narrative, but to actually move. One of my professors in grad school challenged us, all of us, to move to the ghetto. That was his thing. You want to claim, you want to understand these things, but you don't want to put your body in that space. You'll go there with your brain, but you won't go there with your body. And it doesn't become redemptive until your body starts to go through it. Sure. And so, to live in those spaces, I talked to Amy about, we were talking about Southern California and moving down there where Garrett lives. And I was like, how about South Central? And we moved to places like that. And she's just like, no. I'm like, oh. She's just like, no, I'm done. This is good enough. This is good enough. I don't want to do it. I go, and it's so funny, because it's just because her body, there's still those narratives held. There's still those structures held. That's how racism's held in the body. Right. And if we're going to become redemptive forces in the world, we have to confront it in our bodies. And so, if there's anybody, maybe one person in our entire audience will take that challenge and move themselves to that place.
There's a reason why a lot of your spiritual teachers were like, don't get married, don't have family, don't do those things, because it's not compatible. So it's a lot more difficult, right? It's not super compatible with that type of radical living. And
it's more difficult. I would say it's highly compatible, but it is more difficult.
More difficult.
It is our context of being a father and being a husband and living in such a wealthy country has its own. It is its own context for enlightenment.
Right. Right,
but it is, because you're dealing with a collective. If I was just a single monk with no dad, with no kids, and I was on a pilgrimage walking through, and I was home, people would go, "Oh yeah, that makes total sense," and it would fit their narrative. Even our family would, our sister, they all think that I'm kind of pathetic. They don't, because I haven't followed the third dimensional, go work your ass off, make lots of money kind of thing, and but it was a while ago that I realized, like, oh, this is a certain context for enlightenment. Right. This is a very American context for enlightenment. Yeah. Which it is. And it
absolutely.
Turns out your kids, my kids are developing their egos right now. Okay. They're these little kids, they watch Star Wars, and it makes sense. Good guys, bad guys. You know how it is. Your kids, when they're young, they're always going, well, who's the good guys? Who's the bad guys? Yeah. Oh, they got to know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, because their little egos are developing and recognizing, okay, the world is this kind of black and white thing. And my job is to introduce them to complexity slowly, let them wade into that pool slowly. And we do. We just wade into it slowly. We let them kind of, gradually, experience and confront. And living in a place like this, it has its own built-in complexity that they're constantly being confronted with, which is helpful. So.
Okay, so there you go. The myth, hopefully, is dispelled a little bit, and we can all move on and be contributors to peace and justice and love in the world. through spirit instead of ego. If you have further questions, go to the Facebook group and pop in there. We're going to post this from the YouTube link and let us know what your thoughts are. Or even if you disagree, it's okay. Put in there and let us know what you think. It's a really good discussion to have. So I'm just taking a walk around my house here. So anyway, aloha everybody. Thank you for joining us this week, and feel free to share this stuff. You know, we're not talking about porn addiction necessarily, but this might be a helpful discussion for other people, especially right now, especially after that crazy debate last night. Oh, crazy. Anyway, aloha everybody.